The Albany Plan was a plan proposed by Benjamin Franklin to unite all of the 13 colonies for the purpose of trade and land, and it also exaggerated the aggression between the colonies and Britain because Britain denied the plan. Bartolomeo de las Casas was one of the first bishops in the Chiapas, which is like an area in more towards Mexico. And he proposed the new laws, which gave a lot more rights to Native Americans living in the area. Oh my God, okay. Bacon's Rebellion was a rebellion against Virginia Governor Berkeley, led by Nathaniel Bacon, because Governor Berkeley was in support of the Doge Indians even after they were being rebellious against the settlers. And the importance of the Bacon's Rebellion was because it won people the right to vote and had a say in government.
Okay, so the next term is the idea of city upon a hill, and that's basically a term that started with the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and it's basically just all the ideas of America and what they were escaping from Britain. So they really valued their new world, their boundless resources, their freedom of religion and democracy, and it basically embodies an early version of the American dream. So,
we love an Apush queen.
So the corrupt bargain happened during the presidential election of 1824. So basically, Henry Clay pledged his support to Quincy Adams, and then he was elected Secretary of State. So it's like he only supported Quincy Adams because he would get that position of power. So that was kind of an example of corrupt politics. The Declaration of Independence was the first document that declared the United States independence. And it basically stated all the ideals and goals that the United States would be founded on, and it stated their complaints against Britain and showing how Britain had gone too far, and just basically stating their goals as a nation, asserting their independence from Great Britain. And that happened on July 4th, 1776.
Was it?
Yeah.
The era of good feelings was a time period based off of President Monroe's 2 terms. It was a period of strong nationalism, economic growth, and territorial expansion. And since the Federalist Party kind of died out after the War of 1812, there was only one political party that everybody truly did support. And the North did disagree with slavery, and this is where we get things like Harriet Tubman and books such as, I forgot that man's name. Uncle Tom's Cabin, yeah. So Federalist was a term to describe supporters of the Constitution during the ratification. They were strongly against the Articles of Confederation, and they thought that people who were higher in education and higher in the social status in general should be the ones who are making the decisions.
Okay, so the first and second Great Awakenings were just religious revivals, basically just newfound confidence in religion from the people. So the second Great Awakening was starting in 1801, and it was based on Methodism and baptism. So it was basically just talking about salvation through good deeds and tolerance for Protestants, and it had a lot more acceptance of different groups such as women and Native Americans. And from this came a lot of new religious sects such as Mormonism and Unitarianism, and it really defined a unique American religious identity. So it was the first time when Americans had their own religion rather than like Catholicism or Protestantism, which came from Europe.
So the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was a treaty that basically ended the Mexican War. Mexico decided to recognize Texas as part of the U.S., which was divided by the Rio Grande, and it kind of gave Texas a very interesting identity where it kind of was its own country for a while, but now it belongs to the United States, and now it is the Lone Star State.
So the Homestead Act pretty much allowed westward expansion to become a reality for a lot of Americans. So it allowed settlers to move out west pretty much anywhere they wanted, and they could get 160 acres of land and live off of it for 5 years, and they wouldn't have to pay very much. And so it was a really good deal for a lot of people who were trying to move west. And so this was basically the idea of manifest destiny, because the goal was expanding as far as possible and expanding America's reach, and that was what was important. And it really did just volunteer this land away from all of the tribes that used it. America decided that it was theirs and then decided to compensate their citizens for moving onto the land. So it displaced a lot of tribes, arguably very unfair. So the Iroquois Confederacy was basically a political alliance of all of these different tribes. So it was the Mohawk, Onondaga, Oneida, Cayuga, and Seneca tribes. And they basically were a very powerful political force in the colonies. They traded with French, Americans, British. So John Locke was a 17th century English philosopher, and he basically talked about essential human rights, basically just saying that people have the natural rights to life, liberty, and property. And these were the foundational American values that established principles for the Declaration of Independence and people's ideas of what America should be. So his philosophy pretty much defined American values. So he's very important.
Jamestown was the first permanent English settlement that was founded by the Virginia Company of London, and it was led by John Smith, a very interesting man who was involved with Pocahontas. The first actual colony being Roanoke, which faded out much longer ago. Jamestown overall was a major failure if it wasn't for the Native Americans who helped them through trade and other means. The location was terrible, the winters were cold, and it really did start to thrive after the discovery of tobacco in the area, which became a very huge economic, what is the word I'm looking for? A huge cash crop.
Okay. Discoverage.
The Ku Klux Klan was a secret.
Leave that in.
Sorry.
It's not funny. Okay.
It's not.
Okay.
Okay. The Ku Klux Klan was a secret organization that used terrorist tactics in an attempt to restore white supremacy in the South after the Civil War. They were threatened by the fact that blacks and African Americans were able to vote and gained a lot of rights. And they also were very threatened by the idea of slavery being taken away from them, because to them that is a concept of life. It was their everyday function. That's how they got food on the table, and that's how they grew their cash crops in general. So for many, it was very interesting to be able to see that an African American could actually sit next to them or even talk to them normally without being on a plantation serving for them. One sec. The Louisiana Purchase was a territory in the western United States that was purchased from France in 1803 for $15 million. It was the cause of manifest destiny, and it brought a lot of debate to the power of the president, in this case, who bought the land, who was Thomas Jefferson, who bought the land without the Congress's consent from Napoleon, because Napoleon needed the money for war over in France.
The idea of laissez-faire capitalism is basically the invisible hand saying that markets will adjust themselves based on supply and demand. So people's wages will adjust to the market, the prices of things will adjust to the market, and just everything to do with economic regulation is basically pointless, because the market will adjust itself and make everything okay. And this was pretty much the dominating ideology in the Gilded Age in the 1950s, is the idea of free market capitalism, and it doesn't work, so keep that in mind. Alright, so McCarthyism is basically, Senator Joseph McCarthy led a search for communists in America during the 1950s, and they used a lot of kind of unconstitutional methods, just trying to stop communism. They would force people to confess and accuse others. And there was just a lot of anti-communist stigma at the time where they would really just do anything to catch communists.
I can't even speak.
okay.
Manifest destiny is a notion held by 19th century Americans that the United States was destined to rule the continent from Atlantic to Pacific. It was encouraged by the government to move westward with things like the Homestead Act of 1826, and it prompted a lot of trails like the Oregon Trail, the trail that went to, what's the trail that went to Salt Lake City and like Mormons? The Mormon Trail. And other trails. Nixon was the president between 1969 and 1974. I can't remember. He had some environmental policies, but overall everybody mainly just remembers him for
Watergate.
Everybody just mainly remembers him for Watergate. Watergate was, we have Watergate later, I can't go into Watergate.
Vietnam being trash.
Yeah.
Being unapproachable and
You're
not...
spoiling Watergate.
He was not... Look at this face. He was not charismatic and no one liked him because he was ugly.
Yeah. There was a broadcasting of a debate between John F. Kennedy and Nixon, and depending on who you were, if you watched it on the TV, they said that Kennedy won, but if you heard it on the radio, you would say that Nixon won.
I'm pretty sure that wasn't Nixon.
No. Okay. Old Lights and New Lights. Old Lights were Orthodox clergymen who rejected the emotionalism of the Second Great Awakening in favor of more rational spirituality. The New Lights were ministers who took part in the revivalist, emotive religious tradition pioneered by George Whitefield during the Obama served from 2009 to 2006. Obama served from 2009 to 2017, and he was the first African American president. And he was what else am I supposed to say?
He destroyed Libya and Syria, but a lot of people like him because he legalized gay marriage. And so yeah, to Americans it was really significant that he changed a lot of like identity politics domestically. But in terms of foreign policy, he did a lot of airstrikes, and yeah.
Mm-hmm. And he also during his campaign, he also made a lot of people feel like that there was going to be change in America, that times were really going to change, but foreign policy-wise and other than allowing...
Oh, Medicare.
And other than Medicare... Thanks.
Sorry.
Thanks. And other than Obamacare, which was later re-invoked, so nobody fully cares about it anymore. Is it locked?
It better be.
I think God loves us.
All right. That shook the table. Okay.
I'm sorry, that's my fault. Wait, was it the high five? Sorry. Okay. Yeah, I'll just cut it up.
Yeah.
Why
though? Do you need the printer? Do you need the fridge? Why do you need the...
Okay, so Pontiac's Rebellion was a rebellion that occurred after the French and Indian War, or 7 Years' War, whatever you want to call it. And it happened in 1763, which is technically in between the...
It's okay.
We're
gonna pretend.
Okay. And it was a Native American uprising led by an Ottawa chief named Pontiac. They opposed the British because they weren't really keeping any of their promises after the French and Indian War. And they opposed the British also because of the expansion into the Ohio Valley, which once again was not theirs, and began destroying British forts in the area. The attacks ended when Pontiac was killed. This was very important because it showed Native Americans finally being able to come together despite all of their conflicts in the past, and it really did identify a new Native American identity and showed that diverse tribes were able to come together to fight the British.
Okay. I'm probably not gonna have to do this one, / shouldn't do this one. Unless do you think you're gonna cut out a lot of that, or do you think you're...
I'm gonna cut out a good amount.
So a plantation was basically a large-scale farming operation, and they specialized in cash crops such as tobacco, rice, indigo, cotton, things like that. And it was basically just really large plots of land that no one could do on their own, and they were so far away from everything else. So it was basically slave owners had many slaves, and they all worked on this plantation until they died.
Energy.
Okay, so the Quakers were a really important religious group. They denounced slavery, which is why they were persecuted in America, and they were very pro-equality, and they helped with a lot of anti-slavery efforts, so they were very important. So they were founded by William Penn, and he helped them move to Pennsylvania, where they would experience religious tolerance.
Nice. Yeah,
Okay. All right. The Red Scare was a fear that communists were working to destroy the American way of life. So basically, in around the 1950s, the USSR was rising to significance. And so a lot of people feared that the American ideals of like democracy and capitalism would be threatened by the USSR as it was growing. And so this encouraged a lot of imperialist behavior, so that's kind of why we went to Vietnam, to fight against communism. That's why we still do a lot of things. The sexual revolution was basically a movement in the 1960s where people kind of rethought a lot of different sexual norms that were going on. So it changed like gender roles and the ideas of marriage and heteronormativity. And a lot more people were like sexually promiscuous because there was less shame associated with it. So it was just kind of a time when women's roles were questioned and they were able to kind of branch out and do some more things that they might have wanted to do.
Salem witch trials were some trials that occurred in 1692 in Salem, and about 19 people were executed because they were alleged witches. The main impact of this was that it really marginalized the poor people and those who were of different religions and just were mainly outside of the social norm. And the impact of it on the judicial system was that it gave us the right of innocence until proven otherwise.
Temperance movement was basically women gathering around the idea of not drinking anymore. And as women, they kind of experienced a lot of abuse as their husbands would maybe come home drunk, and they just didn't understand why this had to happen, and so they saw alcohol as kind of an evil thing to avoid. So it was basically a women's movement and a really powerful political force it was kind of just women leading a political movement. And it also kind of led to racial tensions between Irish and Italian immigrants. As the temperance movement kind of built up, Irish and Italian people were people who maybe drank heavily, and so it led to a lot of stigma against those groups. All right, Transcendentalism was basically a literary movement that was based on new ideas like living with nature and just living fully and thinking about yourself. And it influenced communities and religious movements and literary movements as they strived to value nature more.
Naturalism.
Yeah, I guess.
Thoreau.
Yeah. Industrialized, a lot more unions grew as workers needed to stand up for their rights. And unions in the United States established minimum wage and better working conditions and better hours. And women and unskilled laborers really made this possible. So like the American Federation of Labor was one of the first ones, and there were many more to come, and unions included all different sects of labor. And some of them reconciled with capitalism and were a little bit less revolutionary, but other ones were better, and those came later.
Nice. That is yours.
Yes. So the Vietnam War happened between 1954 and 1975, and it was basically a fight between North Vietnam, which was communist, and South Vietnam, which was anti-communist. And so the U.S. basically supported South Vietnam in their fight, and it was one of the most controversial wars in American history because a lot of Americans felt like the draft was unfair and all of the things that America was doing against communism might have been unfair, and a lot of people didn't understand it. So that led to a lot of distrust among Americans.
Watergate was a scandal in which various people who were hired by Nixon broke into the Democratic National Committee in 1972, and the subsequent cover-up of the White House involvement leading to eventual resignment of President Nixon under the threat of impeachment. He hired these people to break into the Democratic National Committee mainly to be able to get some source documents in order to help him with the election, even though he was prevalently pretty, oh my god, okay. Even though he was probably going to win anyways.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, this is cringe.
It's okay.
I'm sorry.
Just go.
I know about this stuff, I just
It doesn't
can't
matter,
read about
so
it.
just go.
Okay.
No, do this one.
Okay.
You're done
Okay.
with that. It's fine.
I'll just cut out a lot of that.
Yeah.
The Wilmot Proviso was an 1846 proposal that outlawed slavery in any territory gained from war with Mexico. It was designed to eliminate the land gained after the Mexican War, and it overrided the Missouri Compromise. Malcolm X, oh my god, Jesus Christ. Malcolm X was Martin Luther King's kind of number one rival, original friend. He renamed himself to X to signify the loss of his African heritage. He converted to the Nation of Islam in jail in the 50s and became Black Muslims' most dynamic street orator and recruiter. His beliefs were the basis of a lot of the Black Power movement, built on separationist and nationalist impulses to achieve true independence.
Okay, Yellowstone National Park was the first national park in America, and it was one of the first conservationist efforts. And it was based on the idea that people should enjoy nature and it should be preserved. So it was established in 1872, but the CCC, or the Civilian Conservation Corps, did a lot of work on it during the New Deal because they built infrastructure and such. So it's basically the first national park, and it's significant because it shows that Americans were ready to care about the environment.
No, it's fine.
Zachary Taylor was an early U.S. president, and he was a Southern slaveholder, but he was also against the expansion of slavery, and he was also someone who fought in the Mexican-American War, and he was considered a war hero, and that's kind of why he won the election. Was based on that, but he was against Manifest Destiny, and he was a little bit of an outsider. He was kind of apolitical, and he was not the best.